Hello again. In this video I'm going to discuss stylistic variation, which is our last new symbolization topic, and then I'll show you how to use the symbolization module in a subsequent video. And also in another video how to find out what your Logic 2010 assignments are. Okay, so stylistic variation. Different ways of saying the same thing. So we have the sentence, if Bob runs, then Bill swims. And we could drop the then, and we get if Bob runs, Bill swims. And those say the same thing. And actually, we've already been doing that. And just to remember, the antecedent is whatever comes after the if and before the comma. It's whether or not there's a then there. This is when the if is at the front. And another way of saying the same thing as if Bob runs, then Bill swims, is you could say assuming that Bob runs, Bill swims. Or given that Bob runs, Bill swims. So you could use synonyms for if. There are two other stylistic variants that we want to understand, but before I do that, we just want to make sure we can symbolize if Bob runs, Bill swims. So we'll say that R symbolizes Bob runs, and S symbolizes Bill swims. And so we say, okay, well, the antecedent of the original sentence is Bob runs, so the antecedent of the English sentence, of the symbolic sentence, should be R, and the consequent of the original English sentence is Bill swims, and so the consequent of the symbolic sentence should be S. So we want to have a symbolic sentence where the antecedent is R and the consequent is S. And how do we do that? We put R before the arrow and S after the arrow. Okay, good. Now, think about this sentence. Bill swims if Bob runs. Well, okay, the antecedent is the if part, no matter what. And what's the antecedent? What is the if part of this sentence? It's Bob runs. And so the antecedent of this sentence is Bob runs. So when we turn this into this sort of hybrid of English and logical language, we have Bob runs, arrow, Bill swims. And that's R, arrow, S. We have a different left to right order here, right, between the sentence in English and the sentence in the logical language. In the logical language, the R goes first, before the arrow. In the English language sentence, Bob runs goes second. So they have different left to right order, but it's the same logical order. They both have the same antecedent. They have the antecedent Bob runs, i.e. R. And the different way to think about this is that Bill swims if Bob runs. That says the same thing as if Bob runs, Bill swims. They have the same antecedent because the if in both of them hooks onto the same thing, and they have the same consequent, the other part. And so they should be symbolized the same way. We should have R, arrow, S. So in English, antecedent and consequent is not the same thing as left to right order. They can come apart. They can be different. You can have sentences that have different left to right order, but same antecedent consequent order. And if R then S, in this case, symbolizes both of those sentences equally well. So when you're symbolizing, it's not just left to right. It's find the antecedent wherever it may be, or figure out what the antecedent is, figure out what the consequent is, and then put those in the right places in the logical language. It doesn't matter so much the English left to right order. So it's in English, find the antecedent and the consequent, and then put those in the right places in your logical language, in your logical language sentence, and in the logical language, the antecedent is always on the left of the arrow. So what we want to remember about this is if and its synonyms, like given that or what have you, they always go with the antecedent. They flag the antecedent, whatever the English left to right order is. English left to right order doesn't matter. What does matter is what does the if attach to. The other variant we're going to study is only if. So suppose we have Bob runs only if Bill swims. Well, that says the same thing as if Bob runs, Bill swims. Suppose that Bob does run. What does if Bob runs, then Bill swims tell you? It tells you that also Bill swims. And suppose that Bob runs. What does Bob runs only if Bill swims? It tells you also that Bill swims. It tells you the only way it could have come about that Bob is running is also if Bill is swimming. So these two sentences tell you the same thing. They both let you go from Bob runs to Bill swims. But they use different words to do so. The second sentence, the new one, uses only if. So the consequent of the second sentence is the only if part, which is Bill swims. And so the consequent of the second sentence is Bill swims. And that's the same as the consequent of the first sentence. Bill swims. So they have the same consequent, and they have the same antecedent. They both have the antecedent Bob runs. They both have the consequent Bill swims. In the first sentence, we have an if attaching to the antecedent. In the second sentence, we have only if attaching to the consequent. So in both cases, we have Bob runs, arrow, Bill swims, and that's if R then S. So what you want to remember is Bob runs only if Bill swims says the same thing as if Bob runs, Bill swims, or only if flags the consequent. So you want to remember, if goes with the antecedent, only if with the consequent. So if flags the antecedent, only if flags the consequent. This is whatever the left to right order in English. And the antecedent is whatever comes before the arrow. So those are the two new variations that you need to know when you're symbolizing.